warmly welcome to today's lunch seminar, Safe and Dynamic Field Trips in the light during the pandemic and in the light of the pandemic. Today's digital lunch event is organized by LM International, but we are organizing it in collaboration with a number of Team Sweden actors and also Sida and Sida Partnership Forum, who has helped us to mobilize actors for today's events. And the theme of this hour is to see where are we currently at with the normative dialogue, our strategic advocacy work from Team Sweden. We have all faced a long period with the pandemic where it has been difficult for us to travel abroad, to be with our strategic partners, to be present in the fields, in our cooperation countries, in Swedish Development Cooperation. And we have all been struggling. How do we keep the dialogue alive? How do we make sure that our Swedish core priorities are continuously pushed forward? Not least when it comes to a dynamic climate politics, but also, of course, our feminist foreign policy and other Swedish-related priorities. And in the light of the pandemic, we have seen a number of innovative initiatives by Swedish actors when it comes to designing and organizing digital trips to cooperation countries and field visits. We have also seen now, after we have started to be vaccinated, that some actors in Team Sweden have also started to conduct physical field trips, although taking necessary precautions, considering that the pandemic is still very much present in our cooperation countries. So what are some of the core lessons learned? In what cases do we actually still need to meet up in real life to bring the dialogue forward? And in what cases can we instead use innovative digital alternatives that are more climate friendly and smart, but also more easy considering the current pandemic? These are some of the questions we will be digging into during this lunch hour. And to start off, I actually brought a symbol here. I brought a little Russian doll with me. And as you know, with these Russian dolls, there are several layers. And here I actually have 5 dolls with me in this. And we have actually today 5 panelists who are going to share their experiences when conducting and driving normative dialogue in the era of the pandemic. And also with these dolls, I want to illustrate that the dialogue processes and normative dialogue, it has many layers. What is said officially? What is said unofficially? What is formal, informal? What is noted in an agenda for a meeting or a dialogue process? And what is said in between the lines, implicitly, explicitly? And can this also determine what we can do in real life and what we can do digitally? So we will come back to these dolls later in the panel discussion. But I want now to take the opportunity to introduce our first panelist for the seminar. And that is Cecilia Scharp. She's the Assistant Director General of Sida. And she's been very both strategic and instrumental in taking the normative dialogue forward. So welcome, Cecilia, and I hand over to you to present your lessons learned and also the challenges and opportunities you have seen.
Thank you, Josephine, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really, I'm really thrilled to be participating in this lunch seminar to discuss such an important topic as dialogue. Let me just first say that during the pandemic, the dialogue, the normative dialogue that Sida pursues has not stopped, but we have had to adapt. And I think this is valid for everyone. And I think your introduction, Josephine, very clearly showed that we have to adapt and we had to find new ways of pursuing and conducting dialogue and follow-up, which I think is closely linked. Just a few words maybe on Sida's role and how we work with dialogue or normative dialogue. And first of all, we provide obviously financial support to program and projects. But in combination to advance uptake and implementation of Swedish policies, norms, and thematic priorities by partners, we pursue and conduct normative dialogue, as you said. And we do that, see that both global, regional, and country level. And it's important to realize that we talk at all these levels because they are very much interlinked. And particularly if you're interested in looking at the results, you have to pursue a coherent dialogue throughout systems many times with your partners. And Sida has prioritized dialogue already before the pandemic hit us as one of the key priorities and key tools to advance results for people, for marginal and vulnerable people in countries. One thing we have realized is that we have to have a more cohesive and focused dialogue at these different levels to really reach results. And what we talk about is obviously what you already mentioned. It's the priority areas for Sweden. It's issues like how is democracy advancing at different levels? How is climate change impacting the organization's results and what do they need to do to improve their results? Maybe we talk about gender equality, we talk about catalytic financing and leveraging results, etc. So our dialogue basically is building on a model which builds on close contacts between Sida HQ, our embassies working in countries, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other Team Sweden members. And the dialogue that is taking place in, for instance, boardrooms or annual review meetings with the World Bank or UN system or other consultations is informed very much from how organizations is conducting and behaving in countries. So it's extremely important to understand that for us to be able to have a serious dialogue with global partners of that type, we need to understand what is happening in countries. And there is also an important feedback loop from this, and that is once there has been a dialogue, high level maybe, in a boardroom or an annual review meeting, and we have maybe got a policy change at a certain institution, maybe we have been able to push for a gender strategic framework for UNDP, which was the case a couple of years ago. It's extremely important that this feedback loop goes back into countries and that we from countryside are able to follow up how are these organizations implementing the HQ changes in norms from HQ, for instance. So what did we do when the pandemic hit us? So this was somehow how we worked before and what we want to do, obviously, continuously, but the pandemic made us work differently to pursue this, the dialogue. So the first thing we did was that we initially had close contacts with all partners, of course, and trying to understand their capability of implementing our collaboration and if they were able to reach results or what they needed to adapt and eventually reprogram. And quite quickly, though, we realized that the phone call or maybe an email wasn't enough. So we had to adapt and engage in different platforms, obviously. So we started to use all these Zoom type, Teams type, Skype types tools. And I think we got quite smart after a while and actually were able to have interactive meetings also through these platforms. And as we were also piloting having studio-like events like the ones that you, Josephine, once were piloting at Sida. However, being a government agency, we are sometimes still struggling with security and integrity of this system. So we cannot talk about anything during digital meetings, which is an area where we need to figure out how do we, as you said, talk about the more difficult things. A good thing was also that our multilateral partners quickly switched and adapted and switched to digital meetings. So there were the digital board meetings, digital annual meetings and seminars, etc. And the good thing with that was that we were able to participate with larger numbers of colleagues, both from countries and from HQ. And we were also able to access, as nobody was traveling, we have been able to access higher level of participation, senior managers, etc., engaging in the dialogue. So there has been more pressure in the dialogue, even though we have talked on digital platforms.
May I ask you there, Cecilia, you mentioned, not least when it comes to the drive for democracy, and we have, of course, also witnessed in the light of the pandemic a lot of backlashes when it comes to national elections and civil and political rights. So now when it's possible for you at Sida to conduct few prioritized on-site in real life field trips, what countries do you see as prioritized, and how do you see that this tap into and complement your digital field travels?
Yeah, so we are looking into, as you say, how can we start traveling, and in fact the DirectorGeneral is traveling in a week, and the assistant director is traveling this week. So we have started to travel. But we are prioritizing hard, and we will be going to those countries where the challenges are the greatest, but still there needs to be openings to travel, to real field trips, not only going to capitals. For capitals, we can do digital. So we haven't prioritized in the sense that we say this country or that country, more at the moment looking at opportunities. Of course, the situation with COVID, we are vaccinated, but the people we go, in the countries, they are not vaccinated. So we have to figure out that we do not bring ourselves our contamination or any pandemic to these countries. So there is a lot of considerations you have to do, I still think. But what we try to do is to look at more virtual meetings, which is a hybrid meeting where some people can go to the field and others join from HQ, for instance.
So what I hear from you is that what you will prioritize for physical field trips are to be in rural, remote areas in the cooperation countries, but also to handle more sensitive parts of dialogues that may be, for security reasons, hard to conduct digitally. A final question to you now is, when it comes to bringing together Team Sweden actors for a more constructive and effective normative dialogue, both for Drive for Democracy, but also for other prioritized areas. One of the areas we are looking at right now is the Maputo Protocol for Women's Rights in Africa, and what we can do together as Team Sweden actors to push for this from the side of private sector, CSOs, and in our dialogues with also governments. If you dream big, what do you see also with the use of digital tools? How can we move forward together in the normative dialogue?
Oh dear, that's a huge question, and you mentioned such a particular example, which is maybe a more challenging platform. But obviously, we're talking about different types of platforms that we can bring in different partners to meet. And the nice thing is, obviously, we can bring in country experiences and persons from countries together with ourselves and partners, Team Sweden partners, to have a very open and transparent dialogue. But I think maybe it's also, you have to sequence things. So maybe you can have in-country platform discussions, and then you open up to prepare for a more open dialogue, which is then digital, where everybody can join. So I think looking at opportunities with the digitalization, there are so many interesting opportunities, but it also means that you need to, you need to experiment, and you need to innovate and figure out what is possible. I mean, we talk a lot about this, putting cameras on your head and then, do more films and working together. And so, I mean, all these things are opportunities, and they are not there right now. But I think thinking and bringing and dreaming big, there is several opportunities. And I think we will never go back to the situation where we only do in-country field trips to remote areas. No, I mean, you should always bring in the opportunity to have digital, a combination hybrid meeting, to bring in more people, more experience, more experts, etc. I think that is the way to go going forward, really to bring in different competences and offer opportunities to participate digitally and not having to travel.
And one of the things we actually have done during the pandemic in LM International is that we had staff that were hired to run events to mobilize engagement for the 2030 Agenda. But due to the pandemic, we canceled some events, and actually our staff instead were building up this studio where I'm now standing. So we could reallocate funding and resources to constructively move forward with digital transformation. So I think that's something we need to do together in Team Sweden to see how we can even. I was just in DRC last week, and we were looking at droners and different filming equipment and how to use it also in highly conflict sensitized areas, and where it's hard to sometimes do monitoring by walking. But anyhow, we'll move on, and we'll keep you here, Cecilia, for questions also from the participants. But we'll move on now to our second speaker, Professor Stefan Swartling. And you mentioned, Cecilia, that you have worked intensively with the multilateral dialogues since a great portion of Swedish development cooperation is allocated to the UN agencies. And Stefan, you are here in a joint capacity as representing UNICEF Sweden, and you have also previously worked extensively with child health at the global level for UNICEF, but also you are, of course, acting in your capacity as professor at Karolinska with a transformative health system. So I hand over to you to share your experience of how you have utilized digital transformation for your extensive work on normative dialogue, and what you can foresee, how we can continuously strengthen the dialogue.
Thanks a lot, Josephine, and a pleasure to be with you, colleagues. And you can see it's actually not the UNICEF background today, it's the Karolinska background. So in passing, I can say that finally I could bring all my master's students to Uganda, from Stockholm to Uganda, to meet the master's students' colleagues there, and then they could re-examine each other's health systems, which was really fun and something that I've never been able to do before. But putting on my UNICEF hat, as it were, UNICEF Sweden has traditionally been bringing people on field trips, big donors, collaborators, corporations, politicians, board members, you name it, that kind of thing, which for obvious reasons we haven't done. So we've done 2 digital field trips this year, one to Syria, where we actually brought big donors and corporate partners to meet the Bo Victor Nylund, the Swedish-speaking country rep to Syria. And we also brought along Charlotte Petri Gornitska, the Swedish-speaking deputy executive director of UNICEF. And we had an opportunity to actually discuss COVAX and COVID and vaccine and what are we trying to do. In general, we thought that was highly successful. So we were encouraged and took a second trip to Bolivia, where we actually brought along politicians, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, some Sida colleagues, etc. And then my colleagues, Eva Dalekant and Kerstin and Karin Strömstedt Johansson, they had prepared and worked a lot together with the Bolivia country office for UNICEF. So they had gone out to the Amazons and actually spoken with indigenous people about COVID, about immunization, the logistics, the pros and cons. So we had recorded material. We had the Swedish embassy in La Paz. We had the UNICEF office. And then we were able to actually look at the material and have a dialogue and question and answer. And we generally felt very happy about it because we had the online and the offline, and we were able to bring all of those people to that remote place in the Amazon jungle that would normally have taken you a week to go to, right? So generally we felt encouraged by that. But it started it started like that. Then we went on to recycle the material, because now that we had the film of going and speaking to the Indians about the vaccine and all of that, we took that to a staff meeting. So suddenly the entire Stockholm office could go to La Paz and could go beyond La Paz and actually look at this. And then we cut out a lot of the other material as well. And then we have plans to bring it actually to our donors as well, our monthly donors, and recycling the material and repurposing it for different target groups. So in general, I must say that, and actually to brag a bit, the Bolivia office got the prize among the UNICEF offices in South America for innovative ways of actually bringing in national committees. So it's now spreading across UNICEF Latin America in how they bring in what can otherwise seen as rather, burdensome visits from some donor country. Well, I mean, we've been on that end, I think, in the receiving end of these visitors as well. So in general, we felt quite encouraged. We actually attempted to follow up with some of the people who traveled as well. And the ones who had gone before, they said, well, I really would have liked to talk directly to an immunization worker. And of course you miss that. And one of my politician friends, she actually quantified it. She said, of course, I would rather have gotten 100%, but this took 2 hours and I got 70%. So the cost benefit was sort of pretty good. However, I'd like to say that much as we feel very encouraged and we're going to continue doing this, and if I put it back on my academic hat as well, I don't think this is the thing to do for a new collaboration. This is not for the creative visit when you set up a new thing, when you are storming and norming, and when you need to go and get to know each other as people. But if you're actually talking about all the other things, whether it's following up and running a project that you're running, whether it's taking that staff or exposing them or giving an exclusive view that you would never be able to give to as many people. I mean, how many can go to the Amazon jungle and talk firsthand with immunization workers? I mean, so we feel that, yes, this is the way forward. We're not going back. But it doesn't replace all aspects. So we're still learning how to deal with this new tool. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. So the question is then, if you are looking forward and with hybrid forms, mixing more of digital interactions with actual physical trips, what are you planning for yourself? What will be your first trip now coming up in real life? And how can you use your experience from digital trips and to incorporate that when you start now to travel physically?
If I take this very personally, I was the chief of health for UNICEF and I traveled extensively, but I could never go any place where I wanted to go myself. It was always somebody else who had decided. So when I finished with UNICEF, I said, now I want to go to East Africa and hang out and think of new things and discuss with my friends in Makerere University and in UNICEF Uganda and think of something new. So that's what I still long to do. When we finally get this silly vaccine out of our freezers where it's accumulating and getting it to the people who really need it, and we can open up. So I want to go hang out and be inspired and be creative. That said, I think I need to be very conscious also that when I go, if I'm now going to involve others, what is it I can already now document on my little phone here and take home and think creatively about how to communicate this to the next set of people that I need to work with. Organizationally, UNICEF will actually, of course, proceed with this in terms of field trips to more countries for various types of audiences and segment that. So I think it goes forward on many fronts and it's early days. And in terms of teaching, if I put on my professorial hat, I think it's extremely exciting that you, for the first time, and we actually have better bandwidth. I tried this 10 years ago, and by then internet was not good enough. But now you can actually, at master's level and undergraduate level, you can put students together from across the world and have them study each other's country, each other's system, and do all sorts of imaginative things. So I think we're just starting to learn here.
And thank you so much for giving us this advice to think in terms of what can we recycle from our trips? How can we use our smartphones, iPhones in more constructive ways? How can we collect voices, amplify voices, bring it back to our head offices and staff members, colleagues. I think that's something which is useful for all of us in this seminar to consider if we start going on physical trips. Thank you, Stefan. You will also be staying with us. And now we will go to our third contributor in the panel. We have our little Russian doll here, which symbols for Marcus from VEffect. And it's great that you are actually with us in our studio here. Welcome.
To be here. Yeah.
You kind of like the studio, I heard.
It's beautiful. Beautiful. Good work.
We feel proud as well. We know you also have built a studio at VEffect.
Yeah, we have our own portal to the world. And this one is even better. It's actually, there's room for dancing and parties. Ours is slightly
we have already
smaller.
Concluded, me and Marcus, that our studio is bigger, but their studio is more centrally located in Stockholm. So we will start exchanging the studios for different purposes. Now I want to hand over to you. I mean, you are leading the strategic advocacy and communication work for VEffect, and you have really been spearheading great initiatives when it comes to driving the digital transformation and field visits during the pandemic. So tell us, what have you done, and how did you manage to get our Minister for Development Cooperation on board? We are a little bit jealous.
Oh, you don't have to be. I mean, it's just copy and paste, really. Well, it all started just before really the pandemic hit, that we discussed internally, how can we be more of a global organization, a truly global organization? And this discussion is obviously something that then was just ultimately just geared by the fact that we couldn't meet. So the first step we took was really to ask the former development head minister, Peter Eriksson, if he wanted to conduct a digital field visit to Guatemala, because he was already invited to go and visit physically. And he said, well, obviously we cannot travel. So I said during a meeting with him, would you like to travel virtually then to Guatemala? And he said, yes, sounds great. And then obviously we just had to figure out how to answer that question. No one knew. So I took that question back to the organization and said, okay, so how could we actually offer a virtual visit then? What is a virtual visit? So it just started like we had to solve a problem. And I think that's so interesting about this whole pandemic, how crisis can ultimately drive innovation and then solve problems. The tools were already there. This is not problematic to set up a live feed to meet with farmers that are hit the hardest by the pandemic. And they are facing increasing hunger. They are facing the climate crisis. That was never a problem. It was just coming up with the solution of how we would bring decision makers like Peter Eriksson to meet with our rights holders in countries like Guatemala. Peter never went. So actually one of the first visitors that we have, the premier guest, was a CEO for Lantmännen, one of our member organizations. As he traveled virtually to Mozambique and met with farmers and had discussions on a very horizontal level on what can we do to remedy the effects of the pandemic and on what problems are you facing. So ultimately, it's the same thing as a traditional field visit where you engage with people to see, okay, what are you facing? What are you doing? This led up to having actually several members of the Swedish parliament to go and travel to Kenya. We then invited also Peterson, the development head minister, to travel to Guatemala, along with other organizations. So he went ultimately to do that. So it's been a great learning process. For every trip that we are making, we are learning so much. I mean, we are right in the middle of this, really. And in a few weeks' time, we're going to offer the whole Swedish cooperation and their companies and their employees to travel to Kenya again. And what we're hoping for is to host basically the world's biggest virtual visit, where hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people, will come and see how the hunger crisis, the hunger pandemic, what it ultimately is affecting people in Kenya, and what we need to do to remedy those effects. So that will be like the master task.
So what does this mean for Swedish, Team Sweden actors at large? You are talking about, that crisis can drive innovation and we can now work in more hybrid forms. We can combine digital and physical trips. We can recycle materials. We can have more actors on board. This also sounds that we add complexity into the matrix because we can suddenly reach out to more. How do we limit, for example? You have done some of these now digital trips when it's not anymore about looking at the budget. How many, airline trips do we afford in the budget? How do you actually prioritize participants? how do you limit and how do you also protect and make these field trips safe and not for others to come in? And how have you worked around it?
I would say that we are right in the middle of it. But what we did to start off the whole work is to develop a very, very basic routine and like how we operate during digital field visits. And that relates to all our other policy documents. For example, safeguarding space and making sure that we are, abiding to environmental laws and so forth. So we're really just attaching this new tool in our toolkit to existing documents. But we're not there yet. I mean, we're right in the middle of it. And that's why I'm very happy to be here to discuss it with you. And I'm learning from what I'm hearing from other panelists today as well. And I will be feeding that back into the organization. So I'm very, very happy to have that discussion.
Thank you so much, Marcus. We'll come back to you when we open up for questions from the participants. But now we have our fourth doll here, which will share a little bit about from the side of the private sector. As LM International, we are collaborating with a number of companies. One of them is Sweco, where we work on groundwater systems. And we have Tove Lilja with us today in this lunch seminar. You are section manager for water and environment for Sweco's international operations and for Sweco Environment. And you have experienced how you have managed within Sweco to still conduct actually physical field trips during the pandemic. And we are interested to hear about how have you dealt with precautions that are, of course, when it comes to PCR tests, questions around how to make it safe, how to have the right insurance in place, quarantine regulations, how do you cross different borders? So please share with us your experience on how to navigate and to handle this, but also how you have, of course, also used digital tools to keep the dialogue alive.
Thank you, Josephine. Yes, as you say, we have been traveling throughout the pandemic, but very limited traveling. And first of all, we have tried to avoid traveling through the tools and measures that you discussed previously. In dialogue with our clients and local partners, we have set up the various tools. We have supported our local teams so they can replace some of the international experts undertaking certain activities to avoid traveling. And that has worked surprisingly well, I must say. So I hope that is there to stay. But as you say, in certain cases, we have a number of ongoing projects and we need to ensure implementation of them. And many aspects of implementation need sometimes physical meetings and more personal dialogue. So our staff members have felt that it's necessary to travel in certain cases. And they have been allowed to do that following very strict internal routines that was set up in the very beginning of the pandemic. And it basically takes the form of a travel equation, which each staff member who feel that it's necessary to travel needs to complete, and it needs to be approved at the level of managing director. So it's quite high up in the hierarchy. And that travel equation covers a set of parameters. And if any of those parameters score 0, it will result in a no-go decision for traveling. And the aspects, the most important aspects were, of course, I mean, the rules keep changing all the time, so that the staff member had on paper just before traveling the different rules and regulations for entry into the country, quarantine rules, etc. But also the health and safety aspects of the staff members and the local partners. and access to local health facilities, etc. Insurance aspects. Local confirmation that it's safe for the work to be undertaken in that country, so we don't expose our local partners also. So that travel equation and the pre-planning of all the risks that could happen with precautions when traveling with, in many cases, we travel 2 people in case one person would fall ill with COVID. We had specific, the quality of the masks, the social distancing, etc. But it worked well, but the travel reduced a lot. So the lessons learned are basically that traveling can be reduced if combined in a good way with digital tools. However, to meet in person to person, traveling cannot be reduced to 0. It's very important. But I want to say also another lessons learned is that it was very good. Our project team leaders responsible for projects all over the world are very eager to ensure and to facilitate implementation of those projects. So they are then very eager to travel to make sure that it's all working according to plan, and they're willing to take to sacrifice a lot, sit in quarantine away from family, etc. So it has been good to have that sort of neutral basis for discussion and go, no-go decisions from management level.
Thank you, Tove, for sharing your experiences. And I would just like to follow up with you, because in this lunch event, we have different Team Sweden actors from academia, universities, civil society organizations. We have Sida with us and other prominent actors in Team Sweden representing the private sector side and Sweco. Can you just share with us a little bit, how are you thinking about dialogue? I mean, many might think that you are mainly doing the actual construction work on the ground, building up the systems and putting the pipes in place. But how are you dealing with the dialogue component in terms of adding, the climate and the gender perspective into your construction work? Can you share briefly about that?
The dialogue we undertake are actually basically within the projects. We don't have the resources to engage in dialogue outside of projects. And in projects, the main part of projects we are involved in are development cooperation projects in developing countries. That means that these projects are financed by international finance institutions with where there are many of those aspects built in to the projects when it comes to human rights, to gender aspects, etc. So it's sort of a very natural part of our projects to have dialogue and to support capacity development, to mainstream those aspects into the project and also hopefully beyond the project. So that is what we can do with the tools we have at hand.
Thank you so much, Tove. Tove will also be with us here when we open up for questions. And we have our final 5th panelist now, our last but not least. You got the smallest Russian doll here. Andreas. Andreas is our head of our global unit for innovation and digital transformation. And you have actually been out on physical field trips to Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania to complement the digital field visits we have conducted in LM. So what have been your greatest lessons from this? And how do you motivate, despite looking at the current COVID situation in these countries that is quite severe, but also, of course, the climate footprints. How do you motivate that we have started to engage in physical field trips?
Right, thank you. Which one was this me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I haven't traveled for the last 18 months. I've been stuck in Storvreta, Uppsala, where I live with my family. And of course, engaging in digital meetings all over. But I realized something being on this trip that partnerships is really about meeting one another. And I could experience a huge lack of interaction with these physical meetings. And many of these partnerships, they come up from the fact that you sit down together, you spend time in a relaxed setting, trying to see how can we work together as a team. So it was very obvious, especially in Somalia, with our team when we met with both our partners and government officials as well. So many meetings where they expressed, we are missing the dialogue. We're missing the dialogue on ground. We have our plans, we have our structures to work, but we miss the dialogue partners in our cooperation. So it hit me again after 18 months that, yeah, we need to be present and spend time in our partnerships. And really, I like the illustration you presented with these dolls, because the more time we spend in our meetings, some of us, when we meet, we say we need to sit under the mango tree in South Sudan, sit and talk, hours after hours to really dig into, to understand what is actually the partnership about. So that's the reason why our innovation unit now, we are collaborating with innovation hubs across, because we realize combining working digitally with a face-to-face interaction, these innovation hubs play an important role to just meet. They are connected and they have these face-to-face interactions already. So that's really exciting. But yeah, I think we really need to find time for more face-to-face interaction. There's a need from the talks we had on this trip.
And also, one of the things we have concluded in the senior management of our organization is that what Cecilia brought up early in the lunch seminar about, trust and really seeing what part of the dialogue may not be possible to do digitally, or maybe at least more difficult to do digitally. So we have tried to see in a condensed form, how can we prioritize those kind of conversations in our field trips. So for that reason, when we were together in these countries, as you told us, not least Somalia, we saw that also many conversation happens informally. Can you share a little bit of that? How has it worked for us? I mean, in terms of almost snowball effects.
Of course, meeting our partners in the sitting meetings, new meetings are created, new events to take place. And that kind of interaction wouldn't be possible working digitally, because here we are present in a setting and setting up new meetings, one after another one, leading to reaching the objectives with our work. So that's very, we could see that throughout in these countries and the meetings we had.
Thank you so much, Andreas. And now we have 15 minutes for a joint dialogue with our 5 panelists. And this is the chance, we always strive and try in our events to make them participatory and interactive. So now you have your chance to raise your voice, to ask your question to the whole panel or to specifically one of the 5 panelists. So I open up the floor to you to address your questions. While you see what questions you may have, I would like to ask the first one to Cecilia, coming back to you. After listening to other Team Sweden actors and their experience on digital and physical field trips during the COVID, what's your overall reflection? What's your learning from this?
Thank you. And thanks for all the presentation. It has been fantastic. And there's a lot of learnings to make, obviously. I think that the biggest opportunities lies in these hybrid meetings, going to the field, talking to people, really listening, sitting on the mango tree, but also at the same time being able to share with colleagues. There are many people that can join in this travel digitally and being part of that conversation. So I think these hybrid meetings is really what we need to look out for, and where many people can participate while some are pursuing the real dialogue under the mango tree.
Okay, now we have a question from one of our participants from Lepra Mission, Rune. He's asking, is it advisable or not for us in Sweden to travel to Africa and Asia at this point? Or should we delay to November or even next year? Is it okay to actually travel now? And if so, what could special considerations be? Is there anyone in our panel who would like to answer?
Stefan here, I used to be a physician, so I think you can start to look at yourself. Am I double vaccinated? Am I in a risk group? Do I have some underlying disease and other things? Because whether you protect against COVID or not, chances are you're traveling to a place where the healthcare is overburdened. So I think there are all of those considerations, which I think you need to take with yourself and your physician. But it's also a question, I guess, of what state are the people? Are you a bother, or are you welcome, or are you a nuisance at this stage? How busy are they? But that's the usual question with any trip, right? So those would be my considerations. But now that I have the floor, Josephine, I'm terrible. I wanted to say that this is obviously focused about Sweden and bilateral, but one of the chief advantages I've seen is that in my Karolinska job, we've been able to have people from the DRC together with people from Somalia, from a number of countries and Swedes, so that we've had much more international groups than what we've ever been able to have when we travel only bi-directionally. So I think that's another further advantage of this. Over.
Thank you for pointing out this, because really south-to-south exchanges and global exchanges and mixed dynamic teams is something that we can more easily stimulate and build up now when we use the hybrid forms and digital tools. I have a question here for Marcus. How are you now when it's partly possible to go on travel? How do you foresee that you will be able to mix your learning from digital field trips with, to some extent, also physical traveling?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's an ongoing discussion in the senior management along with our regional directors and so forth. But I think it's all about making sure that we are very clear about the purpose of the visit. We need to establish very clearly, why do you need to do this, conduct this travel? And what I'm foreseeing is a lot more traveling, but digitally, and less physical trips. And when we do physical trips, I think they're going to be longer in length geographically. So if you are doing a physical plane travel, then you need then also to have a corresponding amount of time spent in that region or in that country to kind of motivate that trip. So I think we're going to see fewer physical trips, but longer. But then also it depends on if you're talking about traveling from the head office to a program country or within a program country. That's completely different. And I think that, again, it comes back to the purpose of the trip and the region. But from a head office perspective, that's definitely what I'm seeing. But I would like to encourage us to travel more, but then digitally with maybe a carbon zero footprint. And I'm also encouraging us and other organizations and obviously institutions to put that into your policy documents to make sure that we are striving towards less physical travels that has the climate impact and more digital travels.
And perhaps this is also an area where we, as Team Sweden, can thrive and drive and take the lead globally. We have another question from Natalie. She asked, digitalization brings many opportunities, but a lot of people are also left out due to lack of steady electricity access, bandwidth, internet. How do we ensure inclusion? I know Cecilia really is passionate about this issue, but also perhaps other panelists would like to answer. How do we make sure that we can work more effectively with digital inclusion? Do you want to go first, Cecilia, and then others can complement in the panel? No? Who wants to answer first? Perhaps Andreas? No? Tova, you want to answer? Have you experienced this perhaps in Sweco during some of your digital meetings, etc., differences in the level of access?
No, but it is difficult when you need to have a dialogue in the more rural areas, of course. I mean, there are technical issues. So now, baby steps, we have come one step ahead, but we had now during the summer, not only due to COVID, but also remote areas where there was a conflict coming up in between Ethiopia and Djibouti. But we needed to get in contact with the community representatives, but somehow we managed through local contacts to had other contacts at a lower level who had. So in the end, we could use local people to phone in the remote area, some community representatives, elders, and the committee members. It was a very limited, but we could still cross-check some of the results that we had gotten from other sources. In waiting for something better, as we said before, 70%. You would like to have 100%, but 70% in some cases.
Thank you, Tove. So Stefan,
Stefan would like to say, I don't think we must let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think Tove is describing sort of how we take steps forward, and obviously we need to keep in mind who is not being represented, etc. But I'd like to say that paradoxically, somewhat, almost Swedish legislation at times I feel is hindering this communication, because now when I want to do something digitally and put the film on Karolinska website, for instance, then it needs to be visually interpreted. And it delays everything and it takes time, etc. And meanwhile, I think there are less than perfect tools that you can turn on subtitles now, right? That actually transcribe what we're saying now, etc. So by all means, let not the perfect be the enemy of the good, but be cognizant of who we're missing out and where we want to go. There are 1 billion people with disabilities, one form or another in the world, who are not really properly part of health coverage, for instance. I mean, who are they and how do we reach them and their voices? Yes, let's keep it in mind, but we're making giant steps compared to where we were, aren't we?
And I think digital inclusion really has to be understood in this broader term, not only how to make internet accessible for all, but also to look at different disabilities and how we can work around them on our different digital platforms, websites, etc. We have a good feedback input from Loreen from the International Council of Swedish Industry, Näringslivets internationella råd. Do you want to share with us, Loreen? Or I think you have important insights and learnings.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Lauren McIntosh. I'm a compliance officer at the International Council of Swedish Industry. I just wanted to share, this has been really fascinating for us because we have ourselves undertaken 7 trips since March of this year when we adopted internal guidelines for our travels. And we have been, I myself have been involved in 3 of those trips to Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. And basically, the reason why we have decided to take so many trips during this pandemic is because we are part of a new pilot program funded by Sida. So we're in the process of forming new partnerships. And we found that in most of these instances, it hasn't worked virtually. In some instances, we've had mild success in forming partnerships, but in many of these instances, we needed to go to country in order to actually meet the partners and build trust and show that we're dedicated to the project and so on. But then another thing that we've learned at the same time on the flip side of the coin is that in existing relationships, it seems to be that moving virtually has strengthened these relationships, because before we were relying on travel, and now now it's so much easier to set up digital meetings and have them more regularly. And so we found that there's sort of, it's a two-sided coin in that instance, the new partnerships versus existing partnerships. And then it was interesting to listen to you, Tove, on your risk assessment for travels. And because we have had the same process where we rely quite heavily on broader Team Sweden actors, Business Sweden, who's in country if they exist there, and then also partners. But one thing we have noticed is that often partners are quite eager to encourage travel. So we've tried to go beyond partners in country and check with other Swedish actors working in the region or in country, just to sort of triangulate the information that we've been given. Because we found that in many instances, things look quite different on the ground than what's shared with partners, as I'm sure you've also seen, Tove, in meetings beforehand. So those were just some thoughts. But I was wondering, I had a question for WeAffect there on the virtual visits. It would be really interesting at some point to see what that actually looks like. But have you used that tool to form new partnerships, or was it mostly for partnerships that already existed?
Thanks, Lauren. You mean program partners?
Yes.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
Might be so, but I mean, when in terms of building new relationships, for sure, that's what it's all about, between different stakeholders and our rights holders. And just to give you an idea, to be a bit more concrete, what the virtual visit is for us is ultimately to make sure that we digitally include people from our programs with our stakeholders in one live feed. So it's ultimately an extended Teams or Zoom meeting where we have a live feed, for example, from a farmers cooperative, where you get to engage with people and see on the ground what it looks like right now. And then there's also obviously an interaction to that. What we want to do is, like any other field visits, to stimulate all senses. So we also offer for people that are then located, for example, in Sweden, to have local food and to have, a pre-package where you get to understand the context. You're offering, in so many ways possible, a way to stimulate all senses in that sense, because it's not only about what you hear, it's what you feel that will ultimately make sure that you're committing to change or you're learning. So that's really an important aspect. But we're not taking it all the way to smells, but I think we can explore so many different ways of doing that even better. And we're really, I would say, in the very premier phase of what virtual visits are. And I'm happy to learn from other actors that will be doing the same thing, because I think this is a game changer, really.
Thank you, Marcus. I think those words, this is really a game changer. I think that is a really good way to wrap up this really constructive lunch seminar. And I just want to conclude by saying that from our side, LM International, we really try to break the silos. We try to stop for us to work just as civil society actors or private sectors or foundations or academia or government or Sida and MFA. We have to constructively come together. It's time for us to move forward in the normative dialogue. And we have in this work to use digital transformation. We also have to continue to build deep, genuine partnerships, relationships with stakeholders on the ground. And here we also have to be generous, to share experiences, knowledge, approaches, methodologies, and we will try to explore and see how we can together continue this joint learning Thank you, Sida Partnership Forum, for mobilizing participants and the rest of Sida. Thanks to all other actors, Sweco and We Effect and all others that were here with us today to constructively plan and roll out this seminar. And I wish for all of you to also check the recordings, because we have recorded this lunch seminar. So if you want to spread it to your colleagues and others, you're welcome. And of course, I should also mention Karolinska and UNICEF. You were also an important actor with us today. So thanks once again for joining, and I'm looking forward to see you in different settings.